But I'm going to invite, if that's okay, I'm going to invite John McGeady. And John McGeady is the Justice Officer with the OLA Sisters in Ireland, living in Donegal, but working out of Cork this evening, where he has a community looking in next door. We're delighted to hear. So I'm going to invite John to explain to us a little bit more about the proposed legislation on due diligence in corporate value chains presently before the European Parliament, and how it might apply in the context, and in fact to kind of explain to us a little bit more about what we can do as people who are tuned into this call this evening. So John, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thanks very much to all the speakers, to Veronica and Winifred and Grania. And certainly I think it'll be probably appropriate for any questions coming in relating to what I'm going to talk about, but perhaps Grania might come in as well and assist in answering those as well as appropriate. Well, we heard from Sister Anne in Liberia very briefly explain the powerful impact of legal reform in securing people's rights and the recognition of customary rights in Liberia when she came in and she commented on the conversation between Tony and Sisters Veronica and Winifred. And Grania has also mentioned at the beginning of her presentation the danger human rights defenders face, and I think that brings us to the question of what we living in the security and the relative comfort of Europe, those of us who are in Europe, have. We have a real responsibility to use our democracy to defend human rights and the environment. Sister Winifred compared the power of the modern day corporations to that of Pharaoh in the Old Testament. And, like Moses, and, we're called to replicate the prophets and to do justice. But like Moses, we have a role to play in today bringing the modern Pharaoh corporations, bringing them to heel, basically, and to bring them under the rule of law, and a rule of law that serves justice rather than one that's at the service of profit. So I mean that's what I would like to speak to you about this evening. And Grania mentioned about the due diligence or corporate accountability legislation presently before the European Union. So this legislation, known as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, is a proposed piece of law currently before the European Union, and its intention is to hold corporations accountable for human rights abuses. The proposed EU Due Diligence Directive will require corporations operating in the EU to conduct due diligence across their entire value chains. In other words, corporations will have a responsibility to check that none of the people with whom they do business, for example, their suppliers, or any of the people that they have employed for them, are engaged in human rights abuses or environmental violations. Grania also mentioned in Uganda sort of machete gangs going around terrorizing people to get them off their land. Okay, I mean that might not have been the corporation directly doing that, but you can put a fair bet that they had a hand in paying for that, or in encouraging, incentivizing those machete gangs to go around doing that. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, and all of the sorts of abuses we've already heard about from Winifred and from Veronica. So when we speak about value chains, okay, we mean every single business relationship or transaction involved in producing a good or service, and whether that's growing crops or whether that's mining minerals, to processing, shipping, manufacturing, advertising, and retail. The proposed law will require EU companies to ensure that at no point are the goods or services that they produce, or the material or labor involved at any stage in the process, to make sure that none of it's contaminated by human rights abuses or destruction of the environment. The process of making law in the European Union is pretty complex. It involves three branches of the EU: the Commission, who propose legislation, the European Parliament, and the Council of Ministers, or known as the Council of the EU, who both negotiate the passage of legislation that's acceptable to all three parties. Now, the directive was proposed by the European Commission over a year ago in February 2022, and then the Council of Ministers, representing the governments of the member states, reviewed the draft legislation, and then they agreed on an amended version of the due diligence directive on the 1st of December of 2022. The Council's amended text is now being reviewed and debated and amended by the European Parliament and by various committees of the European Parliament. And so the process continues. And it'll go on like that until the 8th of May, when we expect there to be a vote across the whole of the European Parliament. And then it'll continue in what's known as the trialogue, which is a three-way negotiation, as I mentioned, between the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council of Ministers to finalise the directive. Now, unfortunately, the Council's amendments weakened the proposed due diligence directive. The changes leave the inclusion of the financial sector at the discretion of each member state. And as we heard from Grania, the financial sector plays a massive role in funneling funds and money from country to country in such a way that it avoids detection, it avoids regulation, and it avoids taxation. And this really threatens a race to the bottom, okay? Because no government will want to disadvantage their domestic financial sector by putting laws on it that other countries in the European Union aren't going to impose on their corporate sectors. Likewise, the changes of language to chains of activity rather than a more comprehensive value chain phrase limits the scope of the directive. That makes it more difficult to identify many serious risks further down the value chain. And this especially affects women who are overrepresented at the lower levels of the value chains. Okay, so those who are on the ground, whether it's growing crops or whether it's involved in the manual labor on the ground, or perhaps who are the ones who have to deal with the pollution of their environment and their communities that we've heard about. Now, there are opportunities for advocacy. Okay, the European Parliament are now deliberating this draft directive. Various parliamentary committees have voted on the amendment, and opinions on the draft law have been proposed. This provides us, okay, as EU citizens, with an opportunity to write to our MEPs to request that they advocate for really more robust legislation. And in particular, we need to ask that they focus on a number of ways to strengthen the law. We need them to address the fact that so far the draft directive is gender blind. Okay, as Grania said, it needs to be gender responsive. It needs to take into account the special circumstances that women and girls all around the world face themselves in, as compared to their male counterparts when it comes to the impact of human rights abuses. We need to make the inclusion of the financial sector mandatory and restore due diligence to the full value chain so that corporations will be accountable for all the actions happening and not just a small portion of it. We need to increase the scope of companies included. At present, 99% of businesses will be actually excluded from this new EU law, but the law only makes sense if it applies to everybody. And we need to enable justice for victims. Again, Grania mentioned that the incredible difficulty that people have in actually accessing justice and getting their what's rightfully theirs. There are significant barriers to the ability of communities to take really complex, expensive cases against EU companies, and that needs to be simplified in this new EU directive. And finally, it needs to address dangerous loopholes. Companies may be able to avoid court cases by making people sign contracts beforehand or signing contracts with suppliers so that they kind of are able to sidestep their responsibilities. Now, I'd like to say, that advocacy is a dialogue, okay? It's not a one-off action. So many people on this call may have been on previous webinars organized by AEFJN or events organized by the Irish Coalition for Business Human Rights. And maybe you've already been in touch with your MEPs or with the minister about this issue. But if you have already written a letter on this issue, I'd encourage you to write another follow-up letter. The passage of legislation, it's a long process, many steps involved, as I've explained, and there will undoubtedly be many more changes to the original text before it's finally passed and made into law. So it's our duty to advocate for a final draft of the directive that actually does what it sets out to do. Now, in this process, it's important for our elected representatives to hear from us, the citizens, at each stage of the process, to inform their decision making. When the council was negotiating its draft text, it was important that our government, especially the relevant minister, who was Minister Troy, and then it was Minister Derek Leary, but it was important for them to hear from us. Now it's equally important that our MEPs hear from us. They're elected to represent our views, but if they don't hear from their constituents, they can't be blamed for assuming that it doesn't matter to us. And I think that's really important. They're not all seeing politicians. They need to hear from us to know what matters to us. If you've already written, then, write a follow-up letter. I think that's really important. And the original draft legislation has already been amended by the council and by parliamentary committees. It's important that our MEPs know what we think, as I said, about the amendments that have been made so far and the further changes that we want to support. So advocacy, as I said, it's not a one-off process, one-off action. It's a process. It's a dialogue, and we need to be involved at each step of the legislative process. Now, it's crucial that we draw attention to weaknesses in the legislation, and call for the draft directive to be as comprehensive and as effective to achieve what it's supposed to achieve. Now, no legislation is perfect. But it's important that as far as possible, it promote the common good and it reflect genuine social justice, as I said, rather than serving the interests of profit. When it comes to the question of, who should I write to? Well, at present, write to your MEPs, and you can write to one MEP, you can write to all of the MEPs in your constituency, or you can write to all the MEPs in the country, or indeed you can write to MEPs in other constituencies in other countries. And for those of you who are not from Ireland or are not from the European Union on the call this evening, I'd ask you equally to write to MEPs, as citizens of other countries, to say the European Union is in a really powerful position to have an impact on how corporations do business, and that we're asking you, coming from our country, that you would pass this law and make it as robust and as effective as ever. So what I'd like to do now is maybe share the draft, a template letter that we at AEFJN in conjunction with the Irish Coalition for Business Human Rights have put together for you. It's a template letter. Michelle, maybe you'll screen share that, please. It's a template letter. The idea is to make it as simple as possible for you to use and to send a letter. You don't have to use it. You can write your own personal letter, or indeed you can take the letter that we're going to share with you and you can amend it so that it reflects more of what you want to mention. But it's a template and it's a starting point. And if you simply want to take what we've given you and just sign your name to it and send it, that's equally great. Okay, so I'm not going to go through everything in the letter. Okay, in fact, it really represents what I've already discussed with you this evening. But if you just want to scroll down, Michelle, a little bit to the bullet points. Okay, and these are the key things that we're asking for. Okay, a full responsibility for activities overseas. Recognizing that women are overrepresented in the lower levels of value chains, and so it's important that those value chains are fully scrutinized by corporations. And that women are also included in the consultation, the community and the stakeholder consultation that corporations have to do whenever they're mapping risks, about human rights abuses. We need to widen the scope. As we said, 99% of businesses are presently being excluded from this legislation, so that needs to change. The financial sector have to be included. Okay, at the minute they are being excluded, and that has a huge impact on what businesses and corporations are able to do and the way that they're able to move around their money. At the present, there's no mention of climate. That has to change. There has to be justice for victims, and there also has to be this law should be a floor, not a ceiling. And what I mean by that is there is a threat, I suppose, that the law could be amended so that no government could produce any law that was more progressive, or that did more, or that required more from corporations. And we don't want that. We believe that what the European Union should do is set up a threshold, a basic floor below which no government should fall in its legislation. But the governments all across the EU should have the freedom to bring stronger legislation forward in their own domestic arenas. So that's the draft letter. We'll pop that into the chat. We'll also send it in the follow-up email. I haven't shared it with you now, but we're also putting together a slightly amended version of that letter for any of you who have already sent a letter and you want to send a follow-up letter. And really, I would urge you, those who have sent letters before, please do send a follow-up letter, because it's important that your elected representatives, your MEPs, know that you're following up with them on this issue. You know, they know that it matters enough to you to write to them a second time and to ask them, is there progress happening here? I've written to you already, I'm writing to you again. And we'll prepare a second template letter that we'll share with you as well in the follow-up email for anybody who needs to do that. So if there are any questions, either any technical questions about what I've just described or any wider questions about what you've heard from the webinar this evening, please go ahead and ask. And also equally, if there's any questions for Grania, or indeed any questions for Veronica or Winifred, please ask them as well, and hopefully they'll come on as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending this evening, and hopefully we can all take action to make this legislation a reality. Thanks.
John, thank you very much indeed. That was an excellent presentation. I mean, it was very, very clear, and the letter is super. And we will, as John says, we will make sure that that letter is part of the follow-up after this particular webinar, so that nobody will miss out on it. I might refer to one question that came up while Grania was actually speaking, and I said I might bring this up, and Grania herself might like to come in on it. There was a question specifically that asked, does AEFJN engage in advocacy with the Human Rights Council? And then there was a kind of a comment that, the Forum on Business and Human Rights and the Working Group on Transnational Corporations, that these are other places that AEFJN could be heard. Maybe Grania might know a little bit more about them, but the question about AEFJN, do we engage with advocacy and the Human Rights Council? John, could you enlighten us there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the short answer is no, but the long answer is yes, that's where we're aiming, that's where we're going, and that's what we're hoping to do. AEFJN Ireland is up and running about 1.5 years now. We set up in sort of August, September of 2021, we're now coming to the end of March 2023. So, it's been a slow start, but we're working consistently. We have 10 religious congregations from Ireland as well as AMRI on the Irish branch of AEFJN. We've held a number of webinars. We've written a number of letters to MEPs and to government ministers. And one of the things that we would like to do is certainly look into how we can engage more fully with, not just with the European Union structures, but also with the UN structures. And things like the Council, the Human Rights Council, or any of the other committees. One of the things that we did recently do, and maybe Brian might like to mention this, is there was a voluntary national review by the government into our implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we actually made a submission to that. So maybe Brian, you'd like to comment on that?
Sure. The Irish government are being examined on their progress with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030. We're halfway through at this stage, 2023. So have we achieved halfway? In Ireland and in other places, the answer is no. But the Irish government, as part of their drive to prepare a competent voluntary national review, have invited civil society to prepare their thoughts on what they think should be part of this report. So AEFJN Ireland, given some of what you've heard this evening, have prepared a statement. We were allowed a short space into which we could put our agenda and our issues relative to the SDG achievement. And the one issue, I suppose, that we would have is that the SDGs are not achieved anywhere until they're achieved everywhere. So it's no good Ireland achieving and saying we're doing very, very well. It's not good enough that that's the case. It has to be the case that every country has moved along. So we have included that as another piece of obviously advocacy. So every opportunity we can get to make a difference or put our spoke in, we will definitely do that. Grania, is there anything you would like to add, having heard John speak there?
No, was there another question, Brian, or was it just about the advocacy?
It was just about the advocacy. Do you know anything about the Forum of Business and Human Rights and working group with transnational corporations? That came up with a comment that maybe we could become more involved in that. It came from Edward Flynn, and if Edward is still there, he can put his hand up and he'll come in, or he could even email us afterwards and let us know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I suppose from my perspective, I think John has said it really. I suppose it's at the UN and the EU level, and there is a lot of momentum there. And I know with Action Aid, like we are working as well to support the Feminists for a Binding Treaty at the UN level. So making sure that the binding treaty is not gender blind as well. So it's really great to, at the EU level to be engaged in that as well. I suppose the other area, and I guess, I think Winifred could probably talk to a bit more, but is that corporate advocacy, like as in, I think it can be quite effective when we are you're highlighting the abuses of corporations. They do not like it at all. When you're making noise around their AGMs, or you're collaborating with other networks who are able to, physically go to different, for AGMs and different meetings that the corporations are hosting, because that can be, a way of sort of raising voices and getting the issues out there.
Right.
But
I'm going to actually, I see Edward there has his hand up. So Edward, if you'd like to unmute maybe, and you could make your comment about what you were saying to us a little bit earlier in the chat, and thank you very much indeed for that.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks for all the presentations. Yes, my question is in relation to, in particular, the Forum on Business and Human Rights. It takes place usually at the beginning of December every year, and it's a forum that is probably one of the best attended events in Geneva. You could have up to, or over the years, there has been something in the region of 2,000 different people attending, not all at the same time. But it's one where corporations attend, and it gets a lot of publicity. So I think it is a useful area to engage with. And then there is the open-ended working group on TNC.
Yeah.
So that's also an area, I think, where the voice of AEFJN can be heard. I'd like to put a question to Grania in relation to her presentation, and that was, how is the ILO engaging with the issues that you raised, Grania, in particular in relation to the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh, because the ILO was in Bangladesh for many, many, many years before that took place, and possibly even had, oversight on that building at some stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward, indeed. Grania, go ahead.
Thanks, Edward. And maybe just to respond to the forum question, I've been at that myself, and I suppose, it's interesting, I think, to see the number of corporations that are attending that over the years. There's definitely been an increase, and there's a lot of side kind of discussions and happening. But in a way, I think there's been a lot of criticism for it being a talk shop more so than maybe a place to really influence. And but I haven't had experience since that, maybe in 2018. So yeah, but I say others could. I think in relation to the ILO, and I'm not an expert at all on the ILO and what they're doing, like they have been quite involved in setting up the schemes for compensation for the Rana Plaza victims. And I think they were quite effective in trying to make sure donors were like handling that compensation. And I think they've also done a bit of work around supporting those who are injured in the collapse. But it doesn't seem like there's been a huge amount of work done over the last few years. Now, maybe I'm wrong because I don't know the ins and outs of what the ILO are doing, but it does seem like it was quite focused on the compensation and the support to those who are injured, and maybe not necessarily on corporate accountability.
So thank you indeed, Grania. Before I move on to the next section, because we're coming up, heading for 9 o'clock when we said we would finish, and we do hope to, just before we do that, John, is there any last words you would like to say before I move on, or are you happy enough?
No, just again, just to reiterate and to urge everybody, you know, that letter's been popped into the chat. We'll be sending in the follow-up email. You know, ultimately, we're the citizens. You know, it's on us to make our laws through our representatives, but it's on us, and it's on us to contact them and to advocate for that. So I mean, if we don't do it, who will? So that's ultimately what I'd like to say.
It's a very strong final word. And just to say too that the issue is quite complicated, but I will say that the letter is actually, when you read the letter, it does clear up a lot. So even if you read it afterwards, you'll find, actually, this makes even more sense now that I've heard it from John, now that I read it in my hand. But not to worry if you can't capture it all this evening. We will come back to you as soon as we can with the letter and the presentation of the whole lot again. So once again, thank you to John and to Grania for that presentation. I'm going